My name is Xiao Mina. I'm a director of product at Meedan. Was involved in this project, but will be a moderator for this talk. And here to talk about Electionland, the largest single-day social news gathering effort in journalism history. And to kick things off, I want to just introduce our co-panelists, and then we're going to go to a video to show some of the process. Starting from my right and to your left, we have Scott Klein, Deputy Managing Editor at ProPublica. Ed Bice, who's a CEO at Meedan, my boss, and Meedan is a founding partner at First Draft News. And Fergus Bell, founder at Dig Deeper Media, also a founding member at First Draft News. As we start, we'll cut the lights and we'll play a short video that shows the process and shows the newsroom in action, and then we'll hear from our speakers.
Checking out polling places across our area.
This election is a very significant source of stress. Political and cultural discussions on social media.
Indicators point to record-breaking turnout.
This is a big day to go out and vote.
We're in Philadelphia today because it could theoretically decide who inhabits the White House. The rhetoric of the campaign has been such that people are questioning the sanctity of this process.
I've been covering elections for almost 2 decades. Because of South Florida's history of difficulties for voters accessing polling stations or exercising their right, it is very important for us to report on these issues.
Most newsrooms ask a very important question on election day, which is, who won? It's a great question. It's a super important question. We're asking a different question, which is, who can vote, who can't vote? Where are there problems that are preventing people from being able to vote even though they're eligible?
The story of how voting actually happens at polling places and what the experience is like for the average voter, that's a harder story to track. So the idea behind Electionland was, let's take advantage of technology and data to allow newsrooms and journalists to work together across the country to collaboratively cover the experience of voting on Election Day. What's actually happening at the polls?
I've covered Election Day all around the country, and what I would used to do is look at a map and then just drive around to various schools because that's where polling places are, to see if people had any concerns or to get a sense of what voters were thinking about and talking about that particular day.
It was a little bit of serendipity of being present at the right time, at the right moment where problems would happen.
There are 1,100 journalists working on Electionland, either here in New York, out at local newsrooms, or in the journalism school. So it's an enormous coalition. We're not covering politics, we're not covering the candidates. This is about voting.
Electionland is the first effort to really crowdsource voting place issues in real time with a nationwide network.
We're beginning to see a small cluster of voting machine problems in Philadelphia.
We're seeing a lot of that in New Jersey.
Okay, so machines are
broken machines, only one machine.
In terms of the access to information, what we have now is incredibly high speed access. You know, as soon as something happens, somebody's going to tweet about it or post about it or search for it.
It's gotten a bit more heated because they called police on that.
The great thing about social media and technology is that we have tons of information. The problem is that there's almost too much, and you don't know what's verified, what's true, what's misinformation.
We're sorting signal from noise. All those tips are being brought in. Professional journalists are then looking at where they came from, who the source was.
Well, they were able to verify it. It would help if we could find out where it was.
Yeah, I think it's in the Philadelphia area because I've got a link to Philadelphia at the moment.
Before you put it in, can you just double check?
All of that data will go through a desk called the Catcher Desk, and they'll take the social media data that's been verified, other data sets that are coming in, look for big problems, and then pass those through to our reporters who are here writing, as well as about 450 local journalists to follow up on and hopefully publish or air a story in time for the polls still to be open.
Hi Teresa, this is Paul from ProPublica in Electionland.
The issue is lack of Spanish language assistance in polling places
in Miami area.
Okay.
I'm including a link to his post on Facebook.
Perfect.
Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Data is very valuable because it informs our actions. Everything that is presented through Electionland has been verified already. We do another layer of verification.
There was somebody that explained.
Somebody's playing.
Seems to be pretty smooth, at least in the polling stations that we've been to. It looks like that situation that we got the tip was an anomaly instead of a recurrent pattern.
Is that the woman over there with her daughter?
She went home, she made signs.
We came to this ward in South Philly because we got a tip, and we didn't hear of any intimidation, but we did see a bit of a confrontation over signs.
Yeah, you can tape them on the outside of the fence. You just can't have them inside because they're not official signs.
Is that a Philly law or the
Yes,
rule
well,
for the
basically it's for any polling place, really.
There's almost 1,700 voting places in Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania being a swing state, it can certainly change the election, which is why even these isolated incidents are important to keep an eye out for. The tone of the election makes me concerned that things could be uglier than normal on the streets, and that has not happened, at least in any sort of significant way.
Elections is one of the most important things that we cover as media.
Our ultimate goal is to tell stories that matter to our community.
It is our job.
I think that journalism on its best day can help, ferret out truth and can hold government officials accountable and can make this a better, improved democracy.
Democracy requires transparency. It requires us being able to see what's going on. But this is where data can be really useful. Because one thing to feel emotionally that things aren't right, but actually to know whether or not that's the case is really, really important.
The data overall, I think, is telling us that most of these incidents are isolated and that there aren't huge problems in many different parts of the country. Yes, there have been problems in certain areas, but journalists have been able to go and investigate individual cases and learn that those problems aren't necessarily as widespread as we had feared.
There's been a lot of misinformation out there, but we're dedicated to reporting out the facts. And we're focused on making sure that the truth is what comes out in our reporting and in the reporting of our partners. And kind of watch what my friends were working on, and so I was a little bit jealous. But really it all started when I was having breakfast with Simon Rogers at the Google News Lab about projects that we were doing and projects that we wanted to do. And we realized that we had a shared mission, which is to help newsrooms use data and technology better, and we were talking about ways in which newsrooms might be able to use technologies and data to cover the election in a sort of smarter way, in a way that is hard for them to do if they don't have special data experts. So that's what we kind of both do. And so one of the ideas that we came up with was a way to count not who won, but how the vote was going. I knew from my own experience that long lines at the polling place were a reason that people would often be turned away in the election. Elections are run very differently in the US than in a lot of other countries, probably all other countries. Our ballots are very, very complex. It's not uncommon to have a ballot that's many pages long with many questions and many people to vote for and judges and sheriffs. And it's not just who do you want for president, you hand it in, you're done. And so the ballots are complex. The elections are run by local administrators, never by the federal government. The Constitution and the Congress prohibit that. So even federal elections are run very locally, often by the counties and the states, if not the towns. So there are many thousands of different ways of running an election, different machines, different types. Some are electronic, some aren't. So the elections are very, very complex, and it's very difficult to cover the voting itself. And so we thought that would be a way to do it. And then a couple of things happened that made it into sort of a ProPublica story, one that was about accountability. One of them was, so we were talking about the long lines. So sometimes the ballots are so complex and the machines are broken and things like that. And things happen that make it so that the line is very long to vote. You have to wait a long time to vote. And this sounds like a trivial problem, but in fact, it's the cause of major, major disruption in voting. So this study says that between 500 and 700,000 people didn't vote in 2012 because of long lines. And I mean, that's enough to change the outcome of the race. That's a big difference. And in fact, it's not distributed evenly everywhere. African American people and Hispanic people experience much longer lines, as do college students experience much longer lines than other people. There's also a situation where you can go to vote and be told that you're no longer registered because you didn't vote last time, or you didn't vote 2 times in a row, so they took your name out of the rolls, and now you have to re-register, which they don't tell you about until you get to the polling place when it's too late to register. So in Brooklyn, where I live, which is a very sort of liberal kind of place, 120,000 people were purged from the voting rolls in the Democratic primary in April. And it turned out that if you had a Hispanic last name, you were 60% more likely to be purged than if you had an English last name. And it also turned out that after a major voting law passed in the 1960s, part of it was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013. And after that, many, many states changed how they ran their elections. There were many states, especially in the South, but some counties in the North as well, were required to give any voting changes to the government to approve before they can enact it. And because that was taken away, a lot of states just started making new voting laws. We had no idea how the election was going to run because so many places changed it. So we thought it was important to be paying attention, this year more than ever. And then also it was a very contentious election. Donald Trump said that the vote was going to be rigged, and he told his supporters to go to the polls to defend him. He said that they were 2 of the most disliked candidates in history. They both had very low approval ratings. Donald Trump a little bit more than Hillary Clinton, but they were both very low. And so we wanted to make sure that we paid special attention to this election, not in terms of who was going to win, but how the vote itself was going to be run. After Donald Trump announced that the election was going to be rigged, we changed tactics a lot, and we started bringing on a lot more national partners. So while we designed this to be a way for people to use data from social media and data from other sources to be able to understand what's going on in their local area. So we originally designed this to be local reporters, a tool that local reporters could use to report the election in their area. We ended up also signing on a whole lot of national reporters as well, because after Donald Trump said that. So again, Electionland was really a sort of leads. So it was a way for local reporters to get story leads about voting problems in their area. How did we do it? Does this go to you? I still are going? Okay. So what we did in order to create this, we put together a very large coalition. We'll get to numbers in a second, but the coalition included us, included kind of everybody at this table. It included we brought some national partners on from the beginning, including Univision, which is the largest Spanish-speaking broadcaster in the U.S. We decided to do it physically in a physical newsroom on Election Day, so we brought on CUNY Journalism School. We used a lot of technology. We processed the signals. We processed the social media signals using 600 volunteer journalism school students, who Fergus will talk about. And they actually sifted through social media all day on Election Day and in some of the days before Election Day, looking for people who were saying things like, I couldn't vote, they turned me away, I stood in a line so long I decided to go home, or they made me sign a provisional ballot and things like that. So we had a lot of partners, and this is the way it worked. Again, we had many different data sources. So there is no national data set of voting and voting problems. There really isn't even a national data set of election results, believe it or not, because they're run so locally. So we had to figure out how we could capture these problems if there was no national data set of these problems. So the data sets we had included Google search trends, because Google News Lab was one of our partners, and was a lot of data in Google search trends, people searching for kind of how to get themselves out of trouble, you know, like, they told me I couldn't vote, what should I do, kind of thing. So we had access to Google search trends data. We had access to Twitter and Facebook, and people posting on Instagram, people posting on social media, look how long the line is that I'm standing in, or hey, what do I, you know, isn't this terrible, I couldn't vote, or here's a person doing a bad thing here on the election, or they're fighting or something here on the line. So we had access to Twitter. We had access to a call center. So if you had trouble voting, you could call a telephone number and talk to some attorneys who were on call that would help you vote. And we had access to their software, so we could see all of the reports they had coming in. And we also had about 120,000 people who agreed to let us text them on Election Day to ask them how their voting is going. So we actually had, the more I say it, the more I realize how much it was, but we actually had a huge amount of data that we were pulling in. It didn't feel like too much at the time, but it sounds like a huge amount of data. We had a huge amount of data coming in, and we had 600 journalism school students who were going to process it. So this is the way the flow went. So from my right to my left, the data from all of these sources came in. It was filtered and processed and verified by the journalism school students, working with some professionals in this live newsroom on Election Day. And then that went out to 400 local journalists around the country. You know, I've been to St. Louis, Missouri, twice. They have terrible pizza. They have a beautiful monument. That's about all I know about the city. So I am not qualified to do a city about voting in St. Louis, but I can partner with the newspaper in St. Louis and the radio station in St. Louis, and they know everything about it. So if there is a voting problem at a precinct in St. Louis, they will know immediately, well, that's where the mayor votes, let's go check that out, that's a really big story, or that's the predominantly African-American section of the city, let's go and figure out why there's such a disparity. So this has always been about empowering local journalists. So the goal was then to kind of feed all of those leads out to the local reporters. So we did it in CUNY Journalism School. This is what it looked like beforehand. They have a very large newsroom on the 3rd floor of City University of New York Journalism School. This is what we did to it. We filled it with people. We had about 120 people. We say that because that's what the fire code said, so that's my official story. We sort of filled it with people. Are there more photos? And we kind of, it was literally it was structured exactly like that bow tie. So we had the feeders, who Fergus is going to talk about, who were the journalism school students. We also had most of them were not in New York City. 2 of the schools were in New York. They fed all of the things that they were finding on social media through this is actually.
Scott, can you describe a feeder?
Oh yeah, well, Fergus is going to do that in a second. So, but in the U.S. it's a very standard setup for a breaking news newsroom. So we had people called feeders, who were the ones who were taking the raw information in. So they were taking the raw information in from social media, raw information in from the SMSs, raw information from things like that. They were verifying what could be verified quickly. They were looking for patterns, going back and finding some things that might fit certain patterns. They were handing those leads to a group of professional journalists called the catchers, who functioned much like editors, where they were taking and doing kind of gut checks to see, is this believable what I'm seeing? Does this fit a pattern I'm seeing elsewhere in this state, elsewhere I'm seeing in this area? Adding to it some source-protected data that they were getting from the call center information. So the catchers were sort of synthesizing things, and they were also verifying, kind of doing another step of verification of things. And then the catchers would hand that material over to the national desk, which is where the people were writing for our blog, and also it's where the New York Times and Univision were sitting on election day, and handing those as leads over to the national desk. So you can sort of see the structure kind of go through this way. We actually ended up reseating people on election day, but this is more or less what it looked like. Is there? There's one more. There's one more. Oh yes.
I think that's almost the button.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looked like on election day. So it was very, very big. We had 1,100 people working on election day. So I went from working at one of the smallest newsrooms in the country to one of the biggest for 18 hours, and then one of the smallest again. But briefly, I was the mighty king of a vast army. But we had, as I said, we had 1,100 people working. We had 400 local journalists signed up for leads, 600 journalism school students at 14 schools, and it was about 100, 120 journalists in the live newsroom on election day. So Fergus is going to talk about how the feeders work.
Yes, so I was... Yeah, okay, that's better. So I was running the feeder operation, and what you saw there was the layout of the newsroom is something that we tried to replicate digitally as well, and we tried to replicate that through workflows. So on the screen at the moment is the workflow that the feeders fed into. So on the left we have the journalism schools who were out in the field. Each journalism school operated as their own independent satellite newsroom that were communicating at all times with the CUNY newsroom. We also had the CUNY and Columbia students at the bottom here that were based in the New York newsroom. They were feeding information that they were finding on social media through Check, which you'll hear about later, and Slack, to regional catchers, so professional journalists who were based in New York who were analyzing this and spotting the patterns, as Scott said. And then the rest of it, including things like pizza, and how that was worked out is on there as well. But essentially this workflow was replicated physically in the newsroom as well. So the feeders were responsible for the discovery and the verification. We had 600, I think it was about 650 students in 13 locations, and we were using tools and techniques developed from our work at First Draft. We look at verification and talk about best practice. We were able to practice what we preach for this day. We also had a team of First Draft members there who were known as the elite feeders. So we were physically located in New York, and we were connected with all of the journalism schools. If anyone needed help, we were there to help them. If there was particularly difficult verification, we would dive in and do that. If there was one school or one region that was suffering from a backlog, we would chime in and help with that, or we would have the bigger picture so that we could start working out where we could divert the feeder resources. It's worth saying that you can't prepare for election day, you can't do a dry run, because all of this data was live on social media, and we could go back and look at historic data, but you can't really replicate that flow. So one of the things that we really built in was a feedback loop. So we met every 2 hours to work out how it was going. So we'd have a huddle, and if Scott said, well, at this point there's a log jam, and actually that's because of something that the feeders are doing, and we then looked at what the feeders could be doing differently, and we're able to communicate that out to the group. So the way that we had to verification and social news discovery is something that's quite new to students, even if newsrooms are starting to come on board with it. We had to train people really quickly. So the way that we did this was we assembled a boot camp for the journalism school professors who would come and drink the Kool-Aid, understand about Electionland, and go back with the skills and the assignments for their newsroom staff, which were the students. We also, and I might get Scott to just explain how this worked, but we separated the country up into different regions so that every school was monitoring a different region. And it might look like some schools had a lot, but actually it was worked out in a very careful manner.
Right, so we reported all of this out. Some of you may notice that 3 states are missing, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon. Does anybody know why? Like I said, America's elections are run it's very decentralized. So Washington, Oregon, and Colorado vote entirely by mail. So they don't really have election day in the same way that the other states do. So it's just it's impossible to have long lines and voting irregularity and thugs stopping people from voting and things like that if everyone just mails in their ballot. It happens, it is no longer true, but at the time, last year before the election, it was true that those are the 3 states with vote by mail and also the only 3 states with legal marijuana. But California now has legal marijuana, so it's no longer true. But so we really didn't pay attention to those states, even though University of Oregon was in there. They were looking at other people's states. So we broke up, we did a lot of reporting to be able to break up the country into regions, because we didn't have 50 schools, we only had 14, and we wanted to give schools a reasonable amount of work. So these schools were responsible for finding leads about voting problems in all of these states. Some states are really bad at running elections historically, or end up having lots of problems. Some states are very good at running elections. Minnesota has always the highest turnout rate in elections and the lowest rate of problems, for some reason. But so Minnesota, we didn't need to worry too much. The Dakotas, we didn't really have to worry too much because very few people live there. So it would have been boring for a school to take just those states. So we were able to give, especially in the Midwest Region 3, we gave one school a lot of those, even though, because each state might only have 200 reports in the day. It might be very small. Whereas, Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, each had their own schools completely dedicated to them because we knew that they would have much higher volume.
So what we were trying to do with this is also create this nerve center in the CUNY newsroom that allowed us to be responsive and allow us to react on the election day itself. So this is just a photo of the board that we had up in the room. We had every state. We knew every school that was monitoring every state, and we could look up from the desk and work out which states were opening, which states were closing, where we could divert resources, because we just didn't know how it was going to go on the day, and so we needed that flexibility. So the students were looking for certain things, and we called them signals. Signals were long lines, intimidation, ID requests, machine issues, polling locations. We broke that down. And then what we did was we crowdsourced all of the possible terms related to problems at those, related to those problems at polling places. So this is just a very early version of it, but we had, hundreds of keywords. Those then got turned into search strings that we would work with. This is another workflow. I like workflow diagrams. This is a workflow that shows the signals, the platforms that we used. We also asked some of the students to monitor their local TV, not just CNN, in case there was anything there that would be useful. We then used a number of tools, and we were really lucky that we got access to things like data miner. Facebook gave everyone a Facebook signal for the project. CrowdTangle we worked with, AccuSense. We used all of these tools in order to come up with a system that allowed us to monitor and verify. To do this, we had to work out a standard so that the students were doing this for free. So we couldn't say you have to work an 18-hour shift. We also knew that they would all have different time commitments, and we knew that they were all at different levels of ability. So we had to try and standardize the process that this news gathering took, and the way we standardized it was to make it as systematic as possible. So this is a kind of an example of how we told the journalism schools to set up. Set up your 10 monitoring stations, set it up in these exact ways, and if someone has to go on lunch or if someone has to go home and you swap people in, they can take over that terminal and they don't have to set everything up from the start. We also had this this open hangout with New York throughout the whole day, which was run by Jenny Sargent. So this is actually from Alabama University. They had Jenny in the corner of the room, and we had them in the corner of the room, so that they felt part of the operation. They could see all the people walking around in the newsroom. We could just walk up to the computer screen and talk to them and communicate changes to all of the schools instantly. And there's me doing that instantly. So this feeder operation was, as I said, was standardized. So we asked everyone to prepare Twitter lists. We gave them historical data. We gave them work that ProPublica had been doing to prepare them as best they could. And we got access to all of these tools. We also then started to standardize this verification process, so that if you were one school who said this is verified, it meant the same, verified meant the same thing if you were from a school across the country. This meant that we also standardized the way people cycled through their monitoring setup. Everyone had exactly the same setup, but with just a different focus on region. So we even told the students, this is how you set up your Chrome browser. You have your first tab is a Facebook Live map to see any lives in your region, a Facebook search, Instagram search, YouTube, Google Maps, because that was we needed all of the reports to be located. Intel Techniques, which is, if you don't know, it's very good for diving into things like Facebook, Check, and Twitter. And then on TweetDeck, we told people exactly what columns to set up, and exactly what search strings to use based on all of these things. So what we ended up with was a structured way of every student being able to work. They would start at the beginning and cycle through every single tab with all of these searches set up. They would then cycle through every single column with all of these searches, and any time that they saw something, they would claim it and put it through a verification process. This meant that if we could have created multiple search strings, even more complex search strings, but the flow of data would have been so fast that we needed to slow it down. So splitting it out this way meant that people would be able to actually watch it and know when something new emerged. And so this is the verification checklist that we came up with. This is everything that we asked everyone to perform. So identify the type of issue, determine whether it's original, give the information on the location to as close as you possibly can. Date, we made sure that everyone standardized it into Eastern time so that we were working on the same time, and we could then work. All the data was the same. Contact information, and if they'd spoken to that person. This then went into check.
All right. Okay, thanks, Fergus. So I'm Ed Bice, as An mentioned. I work at Meedan. Meedan is a tools company. We build software for journalists and translators. And I think it's worth, at least for nostalgia's sake alone, thinking back to the first meeting that we had on Electionland. And I believe that it was 94 days before the election. That number sticks in my head, something like this. It was a ridiculously short time frame for us to think about pulling off a project on this scale. And I think that it remains one of the greatest highlights of my career, and those 94 days were among the least pleasant, of my working life. So when Scott and Olivia from Google News Lab and Fergus and Claire and An and Simon and I got together in Washington, D.C., this meeting, we said, okay, couldn't we put some of this energy that we've been placing behind social news gathering to some new effect in the context of a single day news event, the U.S. presidential election. And we had crazy ideas. We had at Meedan, our technology platform was about 6 months into a year-long rewrite, and so we had a technical challenge, we had logistical challenge, we had the challenge of determining new workflows for this. So I guess one thing that I wanted to, before talking about the tool, just talk about what a massive challenge this was and how, it was ultimately successful, but it was a very difficult 94 days. And a testimony to Scott's leadership and all the partners, everyone really pitched in and made huge efforts in the months leading up to the event. So Check was in some ways the backbone for the verification. A great advantage to the fact that we were building the software while this project was launching and working really closely with Scott and Fergus and other project partners was that we could cater the technology to the needs of the project. And technology is always more successful when it's trying to solve discrete user needs. So this was, from our point of view, a big piece of the success of the project. So this is a view of a check report. And I think this is going to be a video. That was a video?
Go back.
That's two.
Just click it once. Okay, yeah, we'll start. It's going.
It's going.
Yeah.
Okay, so the rough workflow of check is finding links out in the wild, bringing them into a project, and we arranged projects around states for the election project. And we have a tool on the back end called Pender that then takes strips of metadata, strips the text, the images, and renders an embed that then can be tagged. So for Electionland, we had a structured set of tags that ProPublica and First Draft worked up. And then we start adding verification information. So the interface as it is designed is incredibly simple. It is collaborative annotation with tagging, with structured tagging, and becomes a way for the journalists and then as you're seeing there, it has a status feature. So for Electionland, we also customized those statuses to fit with the workflows. And so you see now a project page that has a number of reports related to a given state. So here we've got a view of the New York State project. You can see that the top report is marked as in progress. Tom's just 9 minutes ago added it. There's already 3 notes on it. And if I want to click into that and contribute to it, I click on that report, and then I'm taken to a report detail page where I can add my investigation. That investigation might be going down the list, the checklist of source information, location information, time information, or it could also be a free text comment from a reporter saying, I really can't figure out whether this is related to this earlier event, and then hyperlink out to another media object. So the idea is that we provide a empty canvas for collaboration to happen on top of these reports. And so here is we use color to indicate the different states. So these reports have been authenticated, and and so as the catchers are looking at reports, they might take and use the advanced search to look for important in progress from their state, and maybe they're interested in accessibility issues, create that search, and then work from that. So the workflows in the search was built to meet specific use cases for this project, and also we were taking in content from other networks. So here's a long text that's been taken off of WhatsApp and that has been brought into Czech. That becomes then a report that the students can investigate and can dig down a little on. So I'm going to pass it over to An here to talk about some data visualization from the project.
Can I just say one thing first?
Yeah.
One of the really important features of Czech was that we had all of these people working in different locations. If you added the same thing, if someone else found the same thing as you, it wouldn't allow you to double add. It would take you to that original claim, which meant that we cut down on anyone doubling up on the same work.
So one of the features of Czech that, when you're looking at Fergus's checklist is the ability to then take that data and then start to use that for aggregation and visualization. So this is just beginning. This is a highly provisional work right now, the data right now. But we've started working with Peter Lee as a computer science student at Harvard, who's helping us both analyze the data, make sure it looks good, and then start to visualize it. And so we started with Pennsylvania and started mapping the incidents and color coding them by the incidents that were found, and we're planning to do this throughout for all 1,200 reports to start looking at the major trends and through lines that came through this project.
One of the tools that we used in conjunction with everything else was Slack, because we needed to communicate. So we had 1,001 people on Slack, and they all came onto Slack pretty quickly, which was an experience in itself. And having to, formulate rules around Slack use and usernames, and because everyone was working for different organizations, we had to know who we were talking to, and we had to know who we were communicating with very quickly. This slide shows how Slack was replicating the work that was going on in Czech. So you can see the state project in Czech, and then we had all of the state channels in Slack. But we actually had 3 channels for every state. So we had one for feeders and catchers to talk to each other, one for catchers and reporters to talk to each other, and then there was also a Slack bot channel for every state. Can talk about the Slack bots.
Sure. So what we wanted to make sure with Czech was that it interfaced very well with Slack, so that you have this kind of seamless, as seamless as possible process, so that as people are on Slack, they could see the activity in Czech, and then as they're on Czech, they don't need to then send that work back to Slack. So we created what we could just call checkbot to make sure that every time someone was adding a comment, changing a status, this was then going into that relevant channel. And then everything that's there, you could just click and then go back to check. And so it's one way to take advantage of the the strengths of both tools while making sure they could work together.
And then the state feeders also spoke to each other, and that was the way that we communicated around specific incidents in the states. And then we also had one with, we were speaking to just the journalism school leaders, so that and this was another way of having a discrete chat if we needed to say, okay, this is the new direction that we're going in, or these are the new things that we've got to do. And then there was some other technology that was developed by ProPublica.
Oh, just really quickly, we had a bunch of data sources that were not social media that kind of needed a place to live and be sorted through. So we very quickly, one of our partner newsrooms at WNYC, the radio station in New York City, created a program that we called Landslide, which was not, it's a word that means a very large election victory, but it also means, and we didn't really have, we weren't rooting for anybody, but it's also a Fleetwood Mac song. And I swear it's named after the Fleetwood Mac song. But so Landslide let us sift through all of the data that was coming in from non-social media sources. It's just what it looked like. Google also made a trends map. So this was a live map of people searching for words that indicated that they were having they might be having election problems. So if you searched for a long line, or if you searched for a provisional ballot, or if you searched for election intimidation, or words that sort of meant those things, they would show up on this map in real time. And I think the lag was something like 3 minutes. It was really, really,
it inspired some really deep thinking, because the work to find cases of problems on social media is a very certain type of action. Translating a problem into a Google search and how that shows up is very different. So part of the thinking had to go about how the two could come together to give the same result. So this is the last slide.
1,200 social media claims processed by 600 students, again, working in shifts. We generated between 400 and 500 stories that day. And that's data, the stories about us, stories using our data, stories by us, and on and on. We also had a huge amount of impact. There were several states where elect polls were kept open because of stories that we generated. New York City's election hotline was down and they didn't know it. We figured that out and called them and they fixed that. Urban Outfitters was telling people incorrect facts about voter ID. We helped with that, and some problems in Texas. There are sort of lots and lots of things. You know, one of the goals in this was to report out problems in real time so that they could be fixed while people were still voting. It's one thing to report out a problem, 3 days after the election when it's too late. It doesn't really matter. Maybe we'll get them next time. But we were able to report these things out that much more quickly because we had such a large group of people who were using the right technology to be able to see these things, and we were able to help keep people voting.
People ask me
yes.
about tools, and was there one tool, or could there be a tool that does this? The reason why we had to set it up this way and use so many people is that there isn't. And so we had to devise a system that used all of the latest tools out there and some of the greatest minds creating technology in the news space, and we still had to use 1,000 people to do it. So
I think just worth noting that in the wake of this election, Brexit, and of global currents, journalism has been looking inward, and one of the conclusions I think that's being consistently forwarded is that models for collaborative journalism are rational responses to this crisis we find ourselves in. So I think Electionland, while it was a one-day project focused on the U.S. election, the larger takeaway from the project is that collaborative journalism can work, can be hugely valuable, can be empowering to journalism school students, and can, do what journalism is supposed to do, help society. So I think this was a hugely important project. I trust we'll be back together 4 years from now. Well, maybe 4 years from now, we'll be presenting the results of the U.S. election that puts in place the party that's not yet been formed, progressive candidate. But I think Electionland is an incredibly important moment in journalism and journalism tech, and a successful project for us.
We'd be happy to answer any questions if folks have them. We can keep on gabbing. Does anybody have any questions?
Are you planning to do this in other countries as well?
Oh, funny you should ask.
So cross-check is in some ways a, I don't know, we call it's a child, yeah. It's related. So cross-check has been launched in France. The first draft has launched cross-check. The French election is not, as we learned from our friends at Le Monde, is not a single day event. That election day in France is rarely a day of an eventful day, except the outcome, of course. But the cross-check project is framed as a monitoring project on misinformation in the lead up to the French election. That project's being conducted with dozens of media partners in France, using Check and using Slack. So taking some of the lessons and learnings from Electionland and taking that on in France. We're talking about doing a German project, and I really think that this is a recipe that can be successfully replicated.
Yeah. My name is Chris Theodore. I publish The Reader, which is a free public interest journalism magazine in Southern California. And I just wanted to say that we have been developing highly sophisticated journalism collaborative ownership models in which journalists own a media institution, and these all of these models have been based on historical performance, so it isn't theory. And I would be very interested in sharing what we know about how collaborative journalism ownership, in which the journalists own a media entity, can foster what you, or help in what you are doing, because it adds the economic power beyond philanthropy. It's it's a local advertising powered model in which there's huge opportunities, as you probably know, in the United States and in other countries.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? No.
How much did this cost and how did you pay for it?
Follow the money.
I can't remember the exact figure. ProPublica's work and First Draft's look were both supported by a grant from the Google News Lab. Also, I think the Newmark Foundation helped underwrite the work of WNYC Radio, one of the other partners.
Our funding came through Google News Lab. It was in the tens of thousands of dollars. There was, I think, if you count the human effort and person hours that went into this project, with 1,000 journalists working, training for weeks coming into it, there was huge human resource that came into the project free of charge, the seed funding from Craig Newmark and Google News Lab went a long ways.
It clearly cost money to do, but this was the first kind of project like this, which was this collaborative, and people did bring stuff to the table themselves. And if everything that everyone brought had to be covered, it would have been impossible. But everyone came together to work on this, and what we're trying to now do is, so Arne and I have a session tomorrow where we're trying to turn some of this into theory that can be applied to kind of newsroom design and newsroom workflows. So and it was a very open project, so everything's been shared, and we're trying to get it all out for everyone as well. So hopefully it was an investment not just in this one project, but investment in future projects as well.
Questions? Thank you very much. It's perhaps related to the first question. Well, the penetration rate in social media in the US and the access to internet via all the networks are pretty high, perhaps. But how would this project be applicable to developing countries where also the voting fraud is even higher and the transparency is lower? So, which this project would enlighten more problems and bring more transparency and accountability as well?
I mean, we're doing a project, so another child of Electionland is a project we're doing at ProPublica that looks at hate crimes in America, especially since the Trump election. There's been a large increase in racism and hate crimes in the U.S., or overt racism and hate crimes in the U.S., but that doesn't play out on social media nearly as much as the election does. So it's a little bit of an example there. This model still works well. It all still works just as Electionland did, using different data sources. So there's a lot more kind of personal stories told through web forms that I think could very easily translate into text messages. So you could, I think this would scale very well, especially in the developing world for people where people sort of live on SMS. And I think that you could very easily make a bot. We have a service called Mobile Commons in the US, but I think there are lots and lots of them worldwide, where you make sort of an SMS bot that asks people questions. You know, were you able to vote? You know, where was your polling place? Did you see any trouble? And the person kind of responds back and forth until the form is filled out, and that's kind of pulled through the rest of the system and turns into data for local reporters. So social media is definitely one part of this, but doesn't need to be.
And just to add, where Czech is being used, has been used in the University of Hong Kong's journalism program, in a project led by Professor Anne Kruger, and she's working with students to look at misinformation ecosystems leading up to the chief executive election, which just happened a few weeks ago, and they were looking at private social networks like WeChat and WhatsApp, where a lot of misinformation kind of circulates in the Hong Kong context, and so in that case, it's actually students who are researching networks, and so it's a different sort of methodology. But to Scott's point, once you have the signals in place and understand how to find the signals, the rest of the process is can apply. It's just that it has to adapt for the digital and social context in which things operate. And in other contexts, like in East Africa, you might want to focus on radio, for instance, or other sorts of ways that people get their news. In a place like Kenya, where local radio might be in different languages, you'll want to be thinking about both the technological and linguistic context. So in each case, it has to be highly technologically and culturally specific.
Yeah, and another, finding all these children. Another child of Electionland is a project that Innovate Africa Fund is supporting for us to work with in Kenya with PESA Check. And the specific use case that Catherine, the PESA Check founder, forwarded was candidates who are going to rural areas, speaking unrecorded to sometimes large audiences, and lying through their teeth. And and so her vision is to capture that, put it on check, provide the counterexample, debunk that claim, and then publish it out to the web. So this is a great example of something coming from analog to digital and then out to social.
So I think we have time for one more question.
I actually have a question this time, and that is, could you each tell me and everyone tell us what is the single most important thing you learned from this experience?
Work with ProPublica more often.
Trust the people that you're collaborating with. We couldn't have done it if we had to double check each other's work, and we trusted everyone, and everyone did it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just that this model even works. I think we didn't know until fairly late in the day on November 8th that this would work at all. I mean, everything was, as somebody said here, there's no rehearsal election, especially because we started after the primaries. So, just the model works. You can do collaborations this big.
Yeah. And work together in person. Mm-hmm. We tend to rely on digital, but get together and do your collaborations in person when you can. All right. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll be available afterwards for questions.